If you all are on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it and hope you enjoy my videos. Thank you. So let's do it. The most horror story. The Haunting of Hill House is a classic and one of the most renowned horror stories in American literature, originally written by Shirley Jackson and first published in 1959. The story has since been adapted into various films, TV series, and plays, with the most popular adaptation being the 2018 Netflix series, though it differs significantly from the original novel. Here is a detailed overview of the original story. The novel revolves around Hill House, a large, eerie mansion that has been the site of numerous unexplained phenomena and supernatural occurrences. The house is located in a remote area and has a dark history, with the previous inhabitants either having met tragic or mysterious ends. Dr. John Montague, a scholar with an interest in the paranormal, rents the house with the intention of studying it and documenting the strange occurrences that take place there. To investigate, he invites several people who have experienced paranormal events in their own lives, hoping to find concrete evidence of supernatural activity. Among the invited guests is Eleanor Vance, a quiet, introverted woman who has lived a life of solitude and has been caring for her ailing mother. Eleanor's experience with the supernatural is minimal, but she is deeply affected by her invitation to Hill House. Eleanor's story is central to the plot, and her emotional fragility and isolation make her an ideal candidate for the house's sinister influence. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that Eleanor is not only physically drawn to Hill House but also mentally and emotionally tied to it. Another guest, Theodora, a young woman with an enigmatic personality, is also invited to the house due to her previous experiences with paranormal phenomena. The third member of the group is Luke, the heir to Hill House, who is mostly concerned with the estate's financial matters and serves as a less central figure in the story. As soon as the group arrives at Hill House, they begin to experience strange events. At first, the manifestations are subtle: doors that don't open properly, strange noises, and unsettling sensations. However, as the days pass, the occurrences become more pronounced. Eleanor begins to feel an overwhelming sense of dread, and the house seems to take on a life of its own, exerting psychological control over her. She starts to feel a deep connection with the house, believing it understands her pain and loneliness. Her emotional dependency on Hill House grows stronger, and she starts hearing a mysterious voice calling her name, a voice that seems to come from within the walls. The psychological terror in The Haunting of Hill House is intense. Eleanor's growing obsession with the house distorts her perception of reality. She becomes convinced that the house wants her to stay forever, even at the cost of her sanity. Her mental state deteriorates as she grows more isolated from the others, and her sense of self becomes intertwined with the house's dark power. At the same time, Montague, who has been conducting his own investigation into the house's strange history, begins to realize that Hill House may be more than just a haunted location. It is an entity in itself, feeding on the vulnerabilities of those who enter. The other characters also experience increasing paranoia and fear, but it is Eleanor who is most profoundly affected by the house's malevolent influence. Throughout the story, Jackson delves into themes of isolation, mental illness, and the nature of fear. The characters' inner struggles and personal histories are just as important as the supernatural events, and Jackson masterfully blends psychological horror with the traditional ghost story. Eleanor's internal conflict is at the heart of the narrative. Is the terror she experiences real, or is it a product of her fragile mind? The ending of the novel is both tragic and ambiguous. Eleanor's connection with the house becomes so strong that she feels she cannot leave it. In the novel's final moments, Eleanor's fate is sealed in a shocking and poignant way, leaving readers to question the nature of the haunting and the true power of Hill House. The novel's structure and Jackson's use of language are what make The Haunting of Hill House a standout in the horror genre. The house itself is a character, almost a living, breathing entity that controls the events and the people within it. Jackson's subtle use of horror, her exploration of the human psyche, and her portrayal of a woman's unraveling mind make this story deeply unsettling and thought-provoking. The 2018 Netflix series, although loosely inspired by the book, takes significant creative liberties, reimagining the characters and their stories while still keeping the central idea of a haunted house. However, the original novel's influence can still be seen in the series' exploration of family trauma, psychological horror, and the lasting effects of a haunting. Overall, The Haunting of Hill House remains a cornerstone of horror literature, not only for its chilling supernatural elements but also for its rich exploration of human emotion, mental illness, and the complexities of fear. It is a story that haunts readers long after they have turned the last page, leaving them to ponder whether the true horror is the ghostly presence of Hill House, or the psychological toll it takes on those who are drawn into its sinister embrace. The Haunting of Hill House, by Shirley Jackson, first published in 1959, is considered one of the most iconic works in horror literature. The novel, which masterfully blends psychological horror with supernatural elements, is a standalone story. It has, however, inspired a variety of adaptations, including films, TV series, and even some thematic sequels in the form of related works by other authors, but Jackson never wrote a direct continuation of the novel. As a result, there isn't an official second part to The Haunting of Hill House, but the themes and ideas explored in the book have left a lasting legacy in the world of horror fiction. The novel revolves around a group of people invited to stay at Hill House, a mansion with a dark history, to observe any supernatural events. Among them is Eleanor Vance, the central character, who becomes increasingly affected by the house's eerie atmosphere and seemingly malevolent presence. The story focuses on Eleanor's psychological unraveling as she grows more attached to the house, to the point where she starts to believe that it understands her and is calling her to stay. The novel ends ambiguously, with Eleanor's tragic fate, and leaves readers questioning whether the supernatural occurrences in the house are real or a result of Eleanor's fragile mental state. Although Jackson never wrote a sequel, The Haunting of Hill House has inspired other works in a similar vein of psychological horror and has also led to reinterpretations and adaptations in film and television. The 2018 Netflix series, titled The Haunting of Hill House, is not a direct sequel to the book but is loosely inspired by it. The series tells a new story that takes place in two timelines, one following a family's traumatic experiences at Hill House in the past and the other in the present day as they confront the lingering effects of those events. The show explores similar themes to the novel, such as the psychological toll of trauma, isolation, and how the past continues to haunt the present, though the series diverges significantly in its storyline and character development. Despite the differences, the essence of Jackson's work, fear, psychological tension, and the eerie atmosphere of Hill House, remains central to the show. For those interested in a continuation of the themes and style of The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson's other works offer similar psychological depth and exploration of isolation, paranoia, and family dynamics. One of her most famous works after Hill House is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, published in 1962. This novel, like The Haunting of Hill House, delves into the psychological complexities of its main characters, especially the two sisters who live in a secluded house after their family's tragic deaths. The atmosphere of isolation and the question of whether the sisters are haunted by the past or by their own minds is akin to the themes in Hill House. The novel explores the impact of trauma on a family, the tension between perception and reality, and how isolation breeds fear and obsession. These elements make it a perfect follow-up for readers who appreciate the psychological horror in The Haunting of Hill House. Another of Jackson's lesser-known but equally unsettling works is The Sundial, 1958, in which a family living in a large mansion believes the end of the world is coming, and the house itself is imbued with a strange, supernatural influence. This novel also touches on themes of paranoia, mental instability, and the way in which individuals cope with both personal and external crises. It's another example of Jackson's talent for crafting narratives that are equally psychological and supernatural, making it a good choice for those seeking more of her haunting style. While Jackson's own works do not directly continue the story of Hill House, other writers have drawn inspiration from her psychological horror to create works with similar atmospheres. For instance, writers like Henry James with his novella The Turn of the Screw and Susan Hill with The Woman in Black explore similar themes of ghostly hauntings, mental unraveling, and the ambiguity of reality, making them great literary companions to Jackson's work. Outside of literature, adaptations and spin-offs inspired by The Haunting of Hill House continue to explore its legacy. For example, in 2018, Netflix released a critically acclaimed series that carries the title of the novel but introduces a modernized and reimagined version of the story. While it deviates from Jackson's plot, the show explores the emotional trauma and lingering psychological effects of Hill House on a family who experienced the horrors of the mansion. The central idea of Hill House being a malevolent force that consumes its residents is preserved, and the series plays with themes of family, grief, and the impact of unresolved trauma over time. The show's success has led to an anthology series, The Haunting, with a second season, The Haunting of Bly Manor, which takes inspiration from Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, further expanding the universe of psychological horror within the same thematic context. While there is no direct sequel to The Haunting of Hill House written by Shirley Jackson, the exploration of similar themes in both literature and modern adaptations continues to expand upon the ideas she introduced. The eerie atmosphere, psychological terror, and the haunting exploration of the human mind are present in these works, ensuring that Jackson's legacy endures. So, while a formal second part doesn't exist, her impact continues through various interpretations and stories that echo the core elements of her groundbreaking horror novel. It seems like you're looking for some longer horror stories, similar to The Haunting of Hill House. Here are a few classic and modern horror stories, each with a rich narrative that could be adapted into a longer format. 1. The Shining by Stephen King. This classic horror novel follows Jack Torrance, an aspiring writer and recovering alcoholic, who takes a job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, a remote mountain resort. Jack brings his wife Wendy and young son Danny with him. Danny has psychic abilities, which allows him to sense the horrors within the hotel. As winter progresses and isolation sets in, the hotel's malevolent supernatural forces slowly drive Jack to madness. This story is a deep psychological exploration of a family's struggle against evil, and Jack's descent into violence. Why it's long and adaptable. The Shining has multiple layers, including family drama, psychological terror, and supernatural horror. The hotel itself becomes a character, and the complexities of Jack's mind provide rich material for adaptation into a longer format. 2. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This novella follows an unnamed governess who is hired to care for two young children at a remote estate called Bly Manor. Soon, the governess begins to see ghostly figures around the estate, and she becomes convinced that the spirits of previous caretakers, Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, are haunting the children. As the story progresses, the governess's perception of reality becomes increasingly unreliable, leaving readers to question if the apparitions are real or a product of her imagination. Why it's long and adaptable. This story's ambiguous nature, with its focus on psychological terror, makes it a great candidate for deeper exploration, as it can be adapted to various interpretations. The tension between what's real and what's imagined creates a suspenseful atmosphere. 3. The Haunting of Ashburn House by Darcy Coates. In this modern Gothic horror novel, a young woman, Adrian, inherits a mansion called Ashburn House after her estranged aunt dies. When she arrives, she is greeted by strange occurrences, cold spots, strange whispers, and mysterious figures in the shadows. As she unravels the dark secrets of the house's past, Adrian realizes that she might not be the mansion's only occupant. The ghosts of its former residents are very much alive, and they want to keep her there forever. Why it's long and adaptable. With rich descriptions of the haunted mansion and a deep dive into Adrian's own fears, this novel is perfect for expanding into a longer format, offering room for exploration of family dynamics, the house's cursed history, and the ghosts' motivations. 4. Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Set in the 1950s, this horror novel follows Noemi Taboada, a young woman who is sent to a decaying mansion in rural Mexico to investigate her cousin's mysterious illness. Her cousin, who married a man from the wealthy Doyle family, has been sending strange letters asking for help. Upon arriving, Noemi finds that the house and its inhabitants are not what they seem. The mansion itself seems to have a life of its own, and Noemi must uncover the dark history of the Doyle family to survive. Why it's long and adaptable. The novel's Gothic atmosphere and mix of horror and mystery elements provide ample room for a detailed, immersive adaptation. The psychological and supernatural layers, combined with themes of family, isolation, and evil, would make for an intense and atmospheric long-form story. 5. Bird Box by Josh Malerman. In a world where an unknown, terrifying force causes people to commit violent suicides when they see it, a mother, Mallory, is forced to escape with her two children, blindfolded to avoid seeing the horrors that lurk outside. The story alternates between Mallory's harrowing journey through a post-apocalyptic world and flashbacks to the chaotic days when the event first began. As they journey downriver in a desperate bid to survive, the family faces not only the fear of being attacked by unseen forces but also the threat of fellow survivors who are just as dangerous. Why it's long and adaptable. Bird Box explores survival in a world full of unknown horrors and the breakdown of human society. The terrifying aspect of what's never seen, coupled with the psychological tension between Mallory and her children, provides plenty of material for an extended, suspenseful narrative. 6. House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This unconventional horror novel is a story within a story, told through multiple narrative layers. It begins with Johnny Truant, a man who discovers a manuscript written by the mysterious Zampano, which analyzes a documentary film called The Navidson Record. The film follows a family that moves into a house with bizarre, shifting dimensions that seem to defy the laws of physics. As Truant reads Zampano's notes, he begins to lose his grip on reality, and the horror of the house seems to bleed into his own life. Why it's long and adaptable. The novel's structure, with its footnotes, shifting perspectives, and multi-layered storytelling, provides a unique opportunity to expand the narrative into various formats. The house's horror becomes more than just a physical space, becoming a metaphor for personal and psychological deterioration, making it a rich source for adaptation. 7. The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. This psychological horror novel is the second in the Hannibal Lecter series. It follows Clarice Starling, a young FBI agent who seeks the help of the brilliant but psychopathic former psychiatrist Drive Hannibal Lecter in order to track down a serial killer known as Buffalo Bill. As the investigation deepens, Starling and Lecter form an unlikely bond, with Lecter manipulating her while also offering clues to catch the killer. The tension between them grows, creating a chilling and compelling psychological drama. Why it's long and adaptable. The novel's intricate character dynamics, particularly between Starling and Lecter, combined with the detailed, dark psychological thriller plot, offer plenty of opportunities for deep exploration and adaptation into various forms of media, making it a compelling long-form narrative. 8. The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. In this modern psychological horror novel, a family of 3 is vacationing at a remote cabin when 4 strangers arrive, holding them hostage. The strangers claim that one of them must be sacrificed to prevent the end of the world. The family is forced to make impossible choices, with the strangers becoming increasingly desperate. The novel explores themes of fear, trust, and sacrifice in a tense and unsettling way, leaving readers questioning what's real and what's imagined. Why it's long and adaptable. This thriller blends home invasion horror with apocalyptic stakes, creating an intense atmosphere. The psychological depth of the characters and the moral dilemmas they face could easily be expanded into a longer format, offering room for further exploration of fear, survival, and human nature. These stories offer rich and layered narratives that could be expanded into longer formats, exploring psychological depth, emotional struggles, and the complexities of human interaction with the supernatural. Each of them could be adapted into an intricate and thrilling longer horror experience. It seems like you're asking for a continuation or a second part of the horror stories I listed earlier. Based on your request, I will craft a second part for The Haunting of Hill House, as an example, following a similar structure, tone, and themes from the original story, while adding new content. Here's the second part in approximately 15 paragraphs. The Haunting of Hill House. Second part. The oppressive atmosphere in Hill House grew heavier with each passing day. Eleanor had felt its call, its pull at her very soul, and though she was certain the house would never let her go, she wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. The nights were worse than the days. The strange sounds in the walls, the whispering shadows that seemed to follow her footsteps, all felt like a haunting symphony of dread, playing the darkest notes of her mind. Her every movement within the house felt like it was under the watchful eye of something ancient, something unyielding. It was during one such night, when the house was particularly quiet, that Eleanor heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone crying. The soft sobbing echoed from the farthest corner of the house. It was a sound she had come to know over the past few weeks, but tonight, it was different. The cry was deeper, more tortured. She followed the sound through the twisting halls, her breath quickening as she came closer to its source. But when she reached the room from which it seemed to emanate, she found it empty. Her pulse raced as her mind began to unravel the logic. She wasn't sure anymore if she was merely hearing echoes of her own fear or if the house itself was creating these sounds to pull her deeper into its grip. The cry subsided, and the silence that followed was more suffocating than the noise. Eleanor had no idea if it was real, but a feeling in her chest told her that she could never leave Hill House, not without succumbing to whatever dark force had claimed it. The house was no longer just a collection of rooms to Eleanor. It had become a living, breathing entity, something that wanted to consume her, to make her part of its twisted reality. She could feel its weight pressing on her chest every time she entered a new space. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the floors beneath her feet would creak and groan as if they were alive, sighing in satisfaction as she walked through them. Eleanor's time in the house had blurred the boundaries between the real and the imagined. At times, she believed she was the only person left in the house. She would walk for hours, lost in the vastness of its corridors, only to turn a corner and find Theodora Drive. Montague staring at her as if they had been waiting for her to arrive. They looked at her with expressions that seemed to contain both concern and fear, but their presence only made her feel more isolated. Dr. Montague had started to behave differently. The scholarly interest he once had in the house seemed to have faded, replaced with a more personal obsession. He spent long hours alone in the study, reading old records and books about Hill House, muttering to himself. His once calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by a frenetic energy. Eleanor had overheard him speaking in hushed tones about the house's history, and she knew he had begun to believe that Hill House had a mind of its own. One evening, as she was descending the stairs, Eleanor caught sight of Dr. Montague in the hallway, speaking to someone she couldn't see. His words were indistinct, but she could make out a few fragments. "It wants her, you know. It's not just a house. It's alive. It's waiting." The rest of his words were lost in the thick silence that followed. Her thoughts turned back to the strange sounds in the house, the way it seemed to breathe, to pulse with life. Was Dr. Montague speaking to the house itself? Or was he speaking to something that only he could see? Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that the house was controlling all of them. It was leading them down a path from which there was no escape. Theodora had been strangely silent, retreating into herself more and more each day. The once vibrant woman had become a shadow of herself, her eyes hollow and her movements sluggish. Eleanor tried to speak to her, to ask if she had noticed anything unusual, but Theodora simply looked through her, as if she weren't there at all. The distance between them had grown so vast that Eleanor felt as though she was speaking to a ghost, not a person. Then, one night, Eleanor had another vision. This time, she wasn't in one of the rooms. She was standing in the center of a vast, empty hall. A figure stood before her, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that seemed to burn into her very soul. She could feel the coldness radiating from it, an icy presence that made her heart race with terror. The figure raised its arm and pointed directly at her, its finger motioning as if to beckon her closer. Eleanor felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. She could hear the voice in her head, a whisper so faint that it almost sounded like a dream. "Come to me, Eleanor. You belong here. Come home." In that moment, she knew she could not resist. She was part of the house now, and the house would never let her leave. She walked toward the figure, her legs moving of their own accord. As she approached, the figure slowly began to fade, leaving behind nothing but the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. But the next morning, things had changed. Eleanor woke to the sound of Dr. Montague's frantic voice calling her name, his footsteps pounding through the halls. She scrambled out of bed and ran toward the noise, only to find Drive Montague standing in the middle of the foyer, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Eleanor, where were you last night?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "We couldn't find you. We thought." "I was here," Eleanor interrupted, her voice hollow. "I never left." But something in her gaze made him pause, his own fear mixing with uncertainty. He glanced at the others, who were standing in the doorway, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. Eleanor could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Had she been with them? Had she ever really left? Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, but it didn't matter. The house had taken her, body and soul. There was no going back. She could hear the voice again, soft but insistent, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was calling her to stay, to become part of the house forever. And this time, she wasn't sure she could refuse. As the days stretched on, Eleanor knew that the house's grip was tightening. Dr. Montague's obsession had grown, and Theodora, now completely lost in her own world, no longer even acknowledged the others. Eleanor was alone with the house, and the house was everything. It was both her prison and her sanctuary. The house had won. This second part builds upon the tension from the first, exploring Eleanor's gradual mental and emotional unraveling as the house's influence over her deepens. The psychological horror intensifies as the line between reality and the supernatural begins to blur for the characters, particularly Eleanor, who finds herself drawn more and more into the house's dark, insidious grasp. To create a final story based on the essence of all the horror tales mentioned earlier, we can combine the psychological tension, eerie atmospheres, supernatural elements, and the complex interplay of isolation, fear, and madness. Here is an original story that blends aspects from The Haunting of Hill House, The Shining, Mexican Gothic, and others. The House of Echoes. A long-abandoned mansion, hidden deep in the heart of a remote forest, awaited its next visitor. The House of Echoes, as it was known, was infamous for its unsettling past. Its walls whispered of tragedy, lost lives, and secrets better left forgotten. It had been uninhabited for decades, save for the occasional soul desperate enough to seek its dark embrace. Elena, a young woman recovering from a personal tragedy, found herself at the mansion's doorstep. She had come to escape the pressures of the world, to find solace in solitude, away from the noise of her life. The house seemed like the perfect retreat. It was isolated, deep in the forest, far from any prying eyes. But Elena wasn't prepared for what awaited her. As she crossed the threshold, she felt an immediate chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The air was thick, heavy with something ancient, something alive. The house seemed to sigh with relief as she entered, as though welcoming her home. The once grand structure now stood in decay, its windows like hollow eyes, and its walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Soon after arriving, Elena began to hear whispers in the walls, soft at first, like the distant murmur of voices long forgotten. But as days passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke to her by name, as if they knew her deepest fears, her grief, her loneliness. It was as though the house could read her soul, and with each passing hour, she felt its grip tightening. Elena wasn't alone. There were others in the house, although she never saw them. There were the faint shadows in the corners of her vision, the figures that would disappear when she looked directly at them. And then there were the cries, the long, drawn-out wails that echoed through the halls at night, as though the house itself was in pain. She discovered an old journal hidden in a forgotten drawer. It belonged to the house's previous owner, a man named Thomas Carrington, a reclusive artist who had once lived in the mansion with his wife and child. The journal spoke of a tragedy that had occurred years ago. Carrington had become obsessed with the house's strange presence, believing it was alive, that it was calling to him, urging him to create art that could capture its soul. As he painted, he grew increasingly mad, driven by the voices in the house. His wife, unable to cope with his growing madness, disappeared one stormy night, and his child was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The journal's final entry was haunting. The house has taken them both. It whispers my name now. It wants me to join them. I have seen the truth. The house is not just a place. It is alive, and it wants to consume everything. Elena's heart raced as she read these words. The truth was too horrifying to comprehend, but she felt it deep in her gut. The house had claimed its victims before, and now, it was calling for her. She tried to leave, but the door would not open. The house had sealed itself, trapping her inside. The whispers were louder now, turning into full-fledged voices, each one telling her something different, each one trying to break her spirit. One voice sounded like her mother, calling her home. Another, like her late partner, whispered promises of safety. But in the silence between the voices, Elena could hear something else, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the very walls themselves, a sound that vibrated in her chest and made her bones ache. Elena realized the house was alive, and it fed on fear, on despair, on isolation. The more she gave into its whispers, the more it consumed her. The house had taken root in her mind, unraveling her sanity. The shadows were no longer mere figments, they were the souls of those who had been lost within the house's grasp, their spirits trapped forever. On the final night, as the house seemed to close in around her, Elena was forced to confront the truth she had been running from. The house didn't just want her, it needed her. She was the final piece in its eternal hunger, the one it had been waiting for all these years. She felt her mind shatter as she realized she had become just like those who had come before her. She was part of the house now, as much a part of it as the walls and floors that had whispered her name. The next morning, when the authorities arrived, Sent by worried friends who had not heard from Elena in weeks, they found the mansion abandoned once again. The doors were open, the windows wide, but Elena was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no traces of her existence left behind, except for one thing. The journal of Thomas Carrington, still sitting on the dusty table, its pages now filled with new, frantic writing. It was as though the house had claimed yet another soul, and in its echoing silence, the mansion waited for the next visitor to answer its call. This final story blends the eerie, psychological, and supernatural elements of all the stories I mentioned, creating a haunted house tale of isolation, madness, and the inescapable pull of a malevolent force. The mansion is both a physical and psychological prison, drawing the protagonist deeper into its clutches, just as the other stories did with their characters. If you all are on my YouTube channel, I appreciate it and hope you enjoy my videos. Thank you. So let's do it. The most horror story. Here's a dramatic and spooky story based on ghosts, game, the alley of fear, the eerie knock, and the entire game. The Ghosts game. In a forgotten village stood an abandoned mansion known as the Haunted Manor. Whispers of eerie games played by spirits kept everyone away. It was said that anyone who entered the mansion after midnight would hear ghostly whispers daring them to play a mysterious game. One stormy night, 4 friends, Mia, Ryan, Clara, and Sam, decided to investigate the rumors. As the clock struck 12, they entered the mansion. The door slammed shut behind them. A chilling voice echoed, "Welcome to the Ghosts game. Play, or perish." The rules appeared on a dusty mirror. 1. Follow the whispers. 2. Survive till dawn. 3. No turning back. The whispers led them to the alley of fear, a narrow, dark hallway lit by flickering lanterns. Shadows danced on the walls, and faint laughter sent shivers down their spines. At the end of the alley, they found a table with a single candle and a note: "Knock thrice and reveal your courage." The eerie knock. Sam, the bravest of the group, stepped forward and knocked 3 times on the table. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in, and the room filled with ghostly apparitions. The spirits spoke in unison: "Play your part or lose your soul." The friends were each assigned a role in the entire game, a twisted scavenger hunt where the stakes were their lives. They had to find 3 keys hidden in the mansion to unlock the front door. Mia discovered the first key inside a rotting piano, but not before a ghostly hand tried to grab her. Ryan found the second key buried beneath a pile of dusty books that burst into flames as he reached for it. The final key was hidden in a locked chest guarded by a phantom who demanded a riddle to be solved. "I speak without a mouth, I hear without ears. What am I?" Clara, trembling but determined, answered, "An echo." The phantom vanished, leaving the key behind. A terrifying escape. With all 3 keys, the friends ran to the front door. As they turned the keys, the spirits screamed in rage. The mansion shook violently, and the door flew open. The friends escaped just as the mansion collapsed into dust. Breathing heavily, they turned to look back. On the ground where the mansion once stood, a single note remained: "You played well, but the game is not over." This spine-chilling tale combines elements of suspense, fear, and a dramatic escape. Let me know if you'd like any part expanded or customized. If you're referring to a story called Second Parts, here's a creative take on what such a story could be. Second Parts. The town of Ravensbrück had a peculiar legend. People who disappeared for a while returned, different. They called them second parts, as if the original people had been rewritten. Ellie, a bright but introverted girl, never believed in such tales until her older brother, Mark, went missing during a camping trip. Search parties scoured the woods, but Mark remained lost for over 3 months. Then one cold morning, he appeared at the family's doorstep, wearing the same clothes from the night he disappeared, spotless and untouched by time. "Where were you?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling with relief and suspicion. Mark only smiled. "Nowhere special." At first, he seemed normal. His jokes, his habits, even his favorite food. But Ellie noticed subtle differences. He no longer seemed afraid of the dark, even seeking it out. His once expressive eyes now held an unsettling stillness. He avoided mirrors, claiming they gave him headaches. One night, Ellie woke up to whispers. Following the sound, she found Mark sitting in the living room, speaking to no one. His words were strange, like fragments of another language. When she called his name, he turned sharply, his face pale. "You shouldn't be up," he said, his voice hollow. Ellie's unease grew when she discovered scratches on the basement door, as if someone, or something, had been clawing to get out. Mark denied knowing anything about it, but his hands were covered in tiny cuts. The truth unfolds. Determined to uncover the truth, Ellie searched the woods where Mark had vanished. Deep in the forest, she found an old cabin, its walls covered in strange symbols. Inside, a diary lay open on a table, its pages filled with frantic entries. "They're not us. They're what comes after us. Beware the second parts. They don't belong here." The final entry read, "If you see their shadow move on its own, it's already too late." Ellie rushed home to confront Mark. She found him standing in front of a mirror, staring at his reflection, or rather, at the thing in the mirror that moved when he didn't. "You're not my brother," Ellie whispered. Mark, or whatever he had become, smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "No, but I'm better." The fight for the first part. Realizing the second parts were replacements for the originals, Ellie devised a plan. She returned to the cabin and found an ancient ritual inscribed on the walls. The ritual required confronting the shadow of the second part and forcing it to reveal the original. Armed with courage and a flashlight, Ellie confronted Mark. His shadow twisted and grew, detaching itself from his body. It lunged at her, but Ellie stood firm, chanting the ritual words. The shadow screamed, dissolving into smoke. Mark collapsed, unconscious but alive. When he awoke, his eyes were his again, full of warmth and fear. "What happened?" he asked. "You were gone," Ellie said, tears streaming down her face. "But I brought you back." Epilogue. The town never spoke of the second parts again, but Ellie knew they were still out there, waiting for their chance to return. From that day on, she never trusted shadows that moved without their owners. Does this align with the story you're looking for? Let me know if you'd like adjustments. The third part. Shadows Return. Months had passed since Ellie had freed her brother Mark from the grasp of the shadow. Life in Ravensbrück had started to feel normal again, but Ellie could not shake the sense that something was still watching her. The town's legend of the second parts no longer felt like folklore, it was a reality that had touched her family. One stormy evening, while Ellie was preparing for bed, she noticed a strange symbol etched into her bedroom window. It resembled the markings she had seen in the cabin months earlier. A chill ran down her spine. She closed the curtains tightly but felt an unseen presence linger in the room. That night, Ellie dreamt of the cabin in the woods. In the dream, the shadows within the cabin whispered her name, beckoning her to return. When she woke, her hands were covered in soot, as if she had touched something burnt. She realized this wasn't over. The message. The next day, Mark approached Ellie with a strange expression. "Ellie," he said cautiously, "I've been hearing them again. The whispers." Ellie froze. "What do you mean?" "We ended this. The shadow's gone." Mark shook his head. "They're not gone. They're regrouping. They left me a message in the mirror last night. They want you now." Ellie's blood ran cold. The shadows were after her. But why? The stranger's warning. Desperate for answers, Ellie returned to the woods, this time with Mark by her side. As they reached the cabin, they found someone waiting for them, a frail old man with hollow eyes and an aura of dread. "You shouldn't have come back," he rasped. "Who are you?" Ellie demanded. "I was the first," the man whispered. "The first they replaced. And I was the first to fight back. But you've angered them. The shadows don't just take, they evolve. And now, they want to claim their final piece, you." The third game. The man explained that the shadows had a hierarchy. By defeating the shadow attached to Mark, Ellie had disrupted their balance. To restore it, they had initiated a third game, a final test to claim her soul and strengthen their hold over the town. "They'll test your will, your memories, your very sense of self," the man warned. "If you fail, you won't just lose yourself, you'll become one of them." Ellie clenched her fists. "I beat them before, I'll beat them again." The shadows strike. As night fell, Ellie and Mark lit lanterns and entered the cabin. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the shadows were alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. A voice echoed from all directions. "Welcome to the third game. Find your truth, or fade away." Ellie and Mark found themselves separated in a maze of shifting walls and flickering lights. The shadows whispered Ellie's darkest fears. "You should have let Mark go. You'll never be enough. You're the reason they came back." Ellie fought the whispers, clinging to her determination. "You don't own me," she shouted into the void. The trial of memories. At the maze's center, Ellie found a mirror. In its reflection, she saw her family, happy and whole. But as she reached for the image, the reflection twisted, showing her as a shadow, lifeless and cold. Choose, the voice demanded. Your family's happiness, or your freedom. Tears streamed down Ellie's face. I won't sacrifice myself for a lie, she said, shattering the mirror with her lantern. The shards dissolved into mist, revealing a path to the exit. Mark's revelation. Ellie found Mark in another room, battling his own shadow. It loomed over him, taunting him with guilt. Ellie grabbed his hand, shouting, "You're stronger than this. Don't let them win." With her support, Mark banished the shadow, and the room fell silent. Together, they stepped into the cabin's main hall, where the old man awaited them. The final confrontation. The shadows are weakened, the man said, but they'll never stop. Unless what? Ellie asked. You destroy their source, the heart of the shadow realm. But doing so will cost you a part of yourself. Without hesitation, Ellie nodded. Tell me what to do. The heart of darkness. The man led them to an underground chamber beneath the cabin, where a pulsing black orb floated in the air. The shadows swirled around it, screaming as Ellie approached. Destroy it, Mark shouted. Ellie plunged her lantern into the orb. The shadows shrieked, and the cabin began to collapse. Ellie felt a piece of herself being pulled away, a memory, a fragment of her soul, but she held firm. The aftermath. When Ellie and Mark emerged from the ruins, the woods were silent. The oppressive weight of the shadows was gone. You did it, Mark said, his voice trembling with gratitude. Ellie smiled faintly, but she knew she wasn't the same. The shadows had taken something from her, but she had won. For now, Ravensbrück was safe. But deep in her heart, Ellie knew the shadows were never truly gone. They were only waiting for the next game. This third part ties up loose ends while leaving room for more mysteries. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. The final game. Shadows Dominion. The shadows were gone. At least, that's what Ellie told herself. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of their haunting presence began to fade. But deep down, Ellie felt it. The fight wasn't over. One night, as she sat alone in her room, a chilling breeze swept through despite the windows being shut. The lights flickered, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the house. Ellie froze, her heart pounding. She called out, "Mark." No answer. Suddenly, her reflection in the mirror turned to face her, its eyes dark and hollow. "You think it's over," it whispered. The return of the shadows. Before Ellie could react, the reflection shattered, and the room was engulfed in darkness. She stumbled back, but the floor seemed to vanish beneath her feet. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her room but in a vast, cold wasteland of swirling shadows. A voice boomed, deep and menacing. "Welcome to the final game, Ellie. Your defiance has cost us. Now you must pay the price." Ellie spun around, searching for an escape, but all she saw were endless blackened skies and faint, glowing eyes watching her from the void. The shadows. Rules. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and faceless, its form shifting and dissolving like smoke. "This is our domain," it said. "You can leave, but only if you play by our rules." Ellie clenched her fists. "I don't play your games." The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You already are. Win, and you leave. Lose, and you become one of us forever." Suddenly, chains of shadow wrapped around her wrists, pulling her toward a massive, jagged throne in the distance. The voice continued, "Your first task. Survive your memories." The Hall of Regrets. Ellie was thrust into a long, narrow hallway lined with doors. Each one bore a familiar scene. Her childhood, her happiest moments, her darkest regrets. The first door opened, and she saw her younger self, standing helpless as her best friend drowned in a river, an accident Ellie had never forgiven herself for. As she approached, shadowy tendrils wrapped around her legs, whispering, "It was your fault. You could have saved her." Ellie screamed, "No, I was just a kid." The shadows recoiled, but their laughter echoed through the hallway. Door after door, Ellie faced more regrets. Arguments left unresolved, people she'd failed, promises she hadn't kept. The shadows fed on her guilt, growing stronger with every step. Mark's betrayal. At the end of the hall, Ellie found a final door. Behind it was Mark, standing with his back to her. "Mark," she called out. He turned, but his eyes were black pits, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you saved me? You only made it worse." Ellie backed away, her chest tightening. "No, I brought you back." Mark stepped closer, his voice venomous. Did you bring back something else? Suddenly, his shadow lunged at her, pulling her into the ground. She found herself drowning in a sea of darkness, voices screaming in her ears, accusing her of abandoning the real Mark. The shadow's offer. When Ellie finally broke free, she was back in the wasteland, her body trembling with exhaustion. The faceless figure reappeared. You see now, it said. You are no hero, Ellie. You're just as broken as the rest. Surrender to us, and the pain will stop. Ellie hesitated, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. But then she thought of Mark, her real brother, the one she'd fought so hard to save. No, she said, her voice steady. You don't control me. The final trial. The shadows shrieked in fury, and the wasteland twisted into a labyrinth of shifting walls and jagged cliffs. Ellie was forced to run as the ground crumbled beneath her feet. The shadows pursued her, their tendrils snapping at her heels. At the labyrinth's center stood a glowing white orb, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. Ellie knew it was her way out, but reaching it would mean confronting the shadows one last time. As she neared the orb, the shadows formed into a monstrous figure, a towering beast of eyes and claws. It roared, shaking the ground. This ends now, Ellie screamed, charging at the creature with every ounce of courage she had left. Ellie's sacrifice. The creature lunged, but Ellie grabbed the orb, its light burning her hands. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving in the brilliant glow. Ellie felt her strength fading, her mind unraveling as the light consumed her. She whispered, Mark, I'm sorry. With a final burst of energy, Ellie smashed the orb into the ground. The wasteland shattered like glass, and the darkness was swallowed by light. A new dawn. Ellie woke up in her room, the morning sun streaming through the window. Everything felt normal, too normal. She looked around, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. When she called for him, her reflection in the mirror whispered back, You won, but at what cost? Ellie realized that while she had destroyed the shadows, a piece of her soul had been left behind. She was free, but she would never be whole again. And somewhere in the void, the shadows waited, patient as always, for the next player to enter their game. This final chapter amplifies the horror and emotional intensity while leaving a lingering sense of dread. Let me know if you'd like any changes. 12/29, 2:02 p.m. Mr. Unknown thinking face. Here's an original eerie story in English, completely separate from any prior ones. The Silent Forest. In the heart of the mountains, there was a forest that no one dared to enter. It wasn't the kind of place that scared people with growls or howls, it was the silence. A deafening, unnatural quiet that swallowed all sound. Locals called it the Silent Forest, and whispered warnings to anyone curious enough to approach it. Maria, an ambitious journalist, had heard about the forest from a local legend while visiting the nearby village. Dismissing the warnings as superstition, she decided to investigate. She wanted to uncover the truth behind the stories of people entering the forest and never returning. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and her determination, Maria stepped into the forest at dusk. A world without sound. As soon as she passed the tree line, the world seemed to shift. The crunch of leaves under her boots vanished. The rustle of wind through the branches above was gone. Even her own breath felt muted. The silence pressed against her, heavy and suffocating. Maria pressed on, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. She tried speaking aloud, if only to reassure herself, but no sound emerged. Her voice was trapped, just like the forest had trapped every other sound. She noticed something strange. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed alive. Not in the usual way, but in the way the trees twisted unnaturally, as if they were leaning closer, watching her. The Forgotten Camp. After an hour of walking, Maria stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. Tattered tents, a cold fire pit, and scattered belongings lay untouched. She picked up a torn notebook and flipped through its pages. The words were frantic, scribbled in haste. It sees me. It hears me. It knows I'm here. Don't look behind you. Maria's stomach churned, but she pushed her fear aside. She was here to uncover the truth, and she wasn't leaving without answers. The eyes in the dark. As she continued deeper into the forest, her flashlight began to flicker. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches almost brushing her shoulders. Then, she saw it. Two faint, glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness. Her heart raced, but she didn't run. Instead, she raised her camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the forest for a split second, revealing a gaunt, shadowy figure with elongated limbs and a mouth that stretched too wide. The figure vanished as the darkness swallowed the flash. The whispers of silence. For the first time, Maria heard something, a faint whisper. It wasn't from the figure but from the forest itself. The trees seemed to groan, their bark cracking as if they were speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, though the words remained incomprehensible. Maria clutched her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't outside, it was inside her head. The heart of the forest. Desperate to escape, Maria ran. The forest shifted around her, the paths twisting in impossible ways. No matter which direction she turned, she found herself back at the campsite. In the center of the camp, a massive tree loomed. Its trunk was hollow, and inside was a pulsing, glowing mass. Maria felt drawn to it, as if it was calling her. Against her better judgment, she stepped closer. Inside the hollow, she saw faces, human faces, etched into the wood. Their eyes moved, following her, and their mouths opened in silent screams. The truth revealed. Maria realized the truth. The forest didn't just silence sound, it consumed it. The people who had vanished hadn't left. They were part of the forest now, their voices trapped in the trees. The glowing mass pulsed faster, and Maria felt her strength draining. Her camera slipped from her hands as roots snaked up her legs, pulling her toward the tree. The final silence. Maria's last thought before the darkness consumed her was that she had found the truth. But she would never be able to tell anyone. The next morning, the villagers found her camera lying at the forest's edge, its last photo showing her terrified face lit by the flash, and behind her, the glowing eyes of the shadowy figure. The silent forest had claimed another voice. Let me know how you feel about this chilling tale. The silent forest. The forgotten echoes. The villagers gathered around Maria's abandoned camera the next day, their faces pale as they stared at the final image. The shadowy figure with glowing eyes was unmistakable. They whispered prayers, muttered warnings, and vowed never to speak of Maria's fate again. But among them was a man named Ethan, Maria's younger brother. Ethan didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He was furious at the villagers for abandoning Maria to superstition. Clutching her camera, he resolved to do what no one else dared, enter the silent forest and bring Maria back. Into the silence, Ethan set off at dawn with a backpack filled with supplies, a lantern, a machete, and a notebook to document his findings. As he crossed the threshold of the forest, the world's sounds fell away, just as they had for Maria. The silence was suffocating, but Ethan pressed on. He followed faint footprints that led deeper into the woods, hoping they belonged to his sister. Along the way, he found strange carvings on the trees, symbols that seemed to pulsate when he looked at them too long. Signs of Maria. Hours later, Ethan discovered the abandoned campsite. The air felt heavier here, as though the forest itself were watching him. He searched the area and found Maria's belongings scattered around, including her notebook. The last page contained a chilling note. It's not just a forest. It's alive. The silence is its voice. If you hear the whispers, it's already too late. Ethan's resolve wavered, but he pushed on. He had to find her. The first encounter. As night fell, Ethan lit his lantern and continued deeper into the forest. Shadows danced unnaturally in the light, and he began to see movement out of the corner of his eye. Then he saw them, eyes, glowing faintly in the distance, just as they had in Maria's final photo. They blinked, and a low hum vibrated in Ethan's chest, though the forest remained eerily silent. Maria, he called, his voice swallowed by the void. The glowing eyes drew closer, revealing a figure that was both human and not. Its body seemed to shift like smoke, and its face was featureless except for a grotesquely wide mouth. Ethan raised his machete, but the figure vanished before he could strike. The hollow tree. Following the trail of symbols carved into the trees, Ethan stumbled upon the massive hollow tree Maria had written about. The air here felt electric, and the silence was so thick it pressed against his ears. Inside the hollow, Ethan saw the faces, hundreds of them, etched into the wood. Their eyes moved, following him, and their mouths opened and closed as though screaming. Maria, he shouted, his voice breaking the silence for the first time. A faint whisper responded, soft and fragmented. Ethan, leave. The trap of memories. As Ethan reached out to touch the tree, the world around him shifted. He was no longer in the forest but standing in his childhood home. Maria sat on the couch, smiling at him, as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan, she said warmly, you found me. Stay here with me, we're safe now. For a moment, Ethan believed it. But then he noticed the shadow behind Maria. It was moving independently, twisting unnaturally. This isn't real, he whispered. The illusion shattered, and Ethan was back in the forest, his hand still on the hollow tree. Roots shot out of the ground, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the tree's glowing core. The heart of the forest. Ethan struggled against the roots, but they held him fast. As he was dragged closer, he saw Maria, her face half consumed by the tree, her body fused with the wood. Ethan, you shouldn't have come, she said, her voice weak. The forest doesn't let anyone leave. I'm getting you out of here, Ethan shouted, grabbing his machete and hacking at the roots. Maria's face twisted in pain. No, if you destroy the roots, you'll awaken it. The entity awakens. Too late. The tree began to shudder, and a deafening roar filled Ethan's head, though the forest itself remained silent. The glowing mass in the tree's hollow pulsed violently, and the shadowy figure from earlier emerged, larger and more menacing. It pointed at Ethan, and the forest came alive. Shadows rose from the ground, their forms taking on human shapes. They surrounded Ethan, their hollow faces staring at him with malice. A desperate choice. Ethan looked at Maria, her eyes filled with sorrow. What do I do? He asked, tears streaming down his face. You can't save me, she whispered. But you can stop it. Destroy the heart. End this. Ethan hesitated. Destroying the heart might free the forest's victims, but it could also kill Maria, or worse. I can't lose you, he said. You already have, Maria replied, her voice fading. The final blow. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan charged toward the glowing mass. The shadowy figure lunged at him, but he swung the machete, cutting through its smoky form. With a final yell, Ethan plunged the blade into the heart of the tree. The glowing mass exploded in a blinding flash of light, and the forest erupted in an otherworldly scream. The aftermath. Ethan woke up on the edge of the forest, the morning sun warming his face. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But Maria was nowhere to be found. Clutching her notebook, Ethan vowed to return someday, to uncover the forest's secrets and find out if Maria's soul had truly been freed. Yet deep in the forest, the hollow tree still stood, its carvings faded but not gone. And the whispers had started again. The silent forest. The echoes, revenge. Months had passed since Ethan escaped the forest, but the events haunted him every night. Maria's face, fused with the hollow tree, her plea to destroy the heart, and the forest's unearthly silence echoed in his dreams. Though the villagers warned him never to return, Ethan's guilt and curiosity grew stronger with each passing day. One night, he woke to a sound, a whisper. It wasn't in his room but in his head. The same eerie, fragmented voice Maria had used in the forest. Ethan, help me. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Back to the forest. This time, Ethan didn't tell anyone where he was going. Armed with the same backpack and a new determination, he entered the silent forest again. The moment he stepped across the tree line, the oppressive silence returned. The forest felt angrier, the air heavier, and the shadows thicker. Ethan tightened his grip on the machete and pressed forward. He noticed something strange. The symbols on the trees were no longer pulsating but glowing faintly, as though guiding him. They seemed alive, leading him deeper than he'd ever been. The forest fights back. The glowing eyes reappeared, but this time, they weren't distant. They surrounded him, moving swiftly between the trees. Ethan swung his machete wildly, but the shadows didn't attack. Instead, the forest began to shift around him. The ground opened, revealing gnarled roots that twisted into grotesque shapes, and the trees bent toward him, their branches clawing at his clothes. You can't stop us, a voice boomed in his mind, deeper and more menacing than Maria's. You only woke us. The forgotten village. After hours of navigating the ever-changing forest, Ethan stumbled into a clearing. To his shock, there was an ancient village hidden within the woods. The buildings were crumbling, overtaken by moss and vines, but the air felt alive with an unnatural energy. As he explored, he found a journal inside one of the huts. It belonged to a man named Arlen, a researcher who had lived centuries ago. The final entry read, "The forest is not a place, it's a prison. The tree is its heart, but the shadows are its soul. If the heart dies, the forest does not forgive. It consumes." Maria's ghost. Ethan felt a chill and turned to see Maria standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked different. Not fused to the tree but pale and translucent, her eyes hollow. "Ethan," she said, her voice echoing faintly. Why did you come back? You weren't supposed to. I came to save you, he said, stepping closer. Maria shook her head. You can't save me, but you can save yourself, if you leave now. I'm not leaving without answers, Ethan yelled. Maria's ghost flickered, and her voice became distorted. The forest, it's angry. You destroyed the heart, but the shadows, they are endless. Run before they take you too. The shadows strike. Before Ethan could respond, the shadows materialized, more solid and humanoid than before. Their glowing eyes and twisted forms surrounded him, their whispers rising in a chaotic cacophony. Ethan swung his machete, but every time he struck, the shadows reformed. They didn't attack outright. Instead, they circled him, forcing him toward the center of the village. There, he saw it, a second tree, smaller than the first but glowing with the same pulsing light. Its roots spread through the village, cracking the ground and swallowing the ruins. The source of the forest. Ethan realized this was the true heart of the forest, regrown and angrier than before. The shadows were its protectors, and they weren't going to let him leave alive. He approached the tree cautiously, remembering Maria's warning. The shadows screamed, their forms merging into a towering figure with blazing eyes and razor-sharp limbs. You will not destroy us again, it roared, its voice shaking the air. The sacrifice. Ethan hesitated, unsure if destroying the heart again would make things worse. Then he saw Maria's ghost standing beside the tree, her hand resting on its trunk. You can't fight it alone, she said softly. You need to let me go. What do you mean? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Maria's form flickered, her face filled with sadness. The forest keeps my soul trapped. If I join it completely, it will weaken. But once I'm gone, I can't come back. Ethan's heart broke, but he knew what he had to do. The final confrontation. With tears streaming down his face, Ethan stepped toward the tree. Maria nodded, her form dissolving into light as she merged with the heart. The tree began to tremble, its glow fading as cracks spread across its surface. The shadowy figure roared, lunging at Ethan, but he plunged his machete into the tree one final time. The forest erupted in light, the shadows screaming as they dissolved into nothingness. The aftermath. When Ethan woke, he was lying at the edge of the forest. The air was no longer heavy, and the silence was gone. The trees looked ordinary, their sinister shapes erased. But Maria was gone. In his hand, he found a locket he'd never seen before. Inside was a picture of Maria, smiling. On the back was an inscription, "Thank you for setting me free." Ethan left the forest for good, knowing he'd done what he could. But deep in his heart, he wondered if the shadows were truly gone, or if they were simply waiting for someone else to disturb their silence. The silent forest. The final silence. Ethan had survived the silent forest twice, but his encounters left him scarred. The forest's whispers still lingered in his dreams, and the weight of Maria's sacrifice hung heavy on his soul. Yet, the unease wouldn't leave him. The villagers said the forest was quiet now, lifeless and ordinary, but Ethan felt something deeper, unfinished. Late one night, as the winds howled through the village, Ethan woke to find his room colder than it should have been. The air was still, and on his desk sat Maria's locket, glowing faintly. A single whisper broke the silence, "Come back. It's not over." The final return. Ethan prepared for his last journey into the forest, knowing this time he might not return. Armed with the locket, his machete, and a torch, he stepped into the forest at dawn. The forest felt different now, not silent, but alive with sound. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and yet something unnatural lingered in the air. The glowing symbols had vanished, and the oppressive presence was gone. Ethan ventured deeper, following a faint trail marked by the occasional glow of Maria's locket. The deeper he went, the more he realized, the forest was changing. The gathering shadows. As night fell, the familiar glowing eyes returned, but this time, they weren't scattered. They gathered in a single line, blocking Ethan's path. A towering shadow rose among them, its form massive and humanoid, with countless faces writhing across its body. "You thought you ended us," the shadow boomed, its voice shaking the earth. "But we are eternal. We are the silence between life and death." Ethan gripped the locket tightly, feeling a surge of warmth. Maria's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "You must end this, all of it." The true source. Ethan followed the shadow's retreating form to a massive clearing he had never seen before. At its center stood a colossal tree, far larger and more menacing than the ones before. Its roots stretched across the ground like veins, pulsating with an ominous glow. This was the true heart of the forest, the source of its power and the origin of its darkness. The shadow reappeared, surrounding the tree, its many faces twisting in agony. You cannot destroy what we are. We are the void, the stillness that follows every scream. Maria's light. Ethan held up the locket, and it began to glow brighter, illuminating the clearing. The shadows recoiled, their forms distorting in the light. From the locket, Maria's voice emerged, stronger and clearer than before. The forest thrives on fear, on the souls it traps. It can only be destroyed if no fear remains. But how? Ethan shouted, the shadows closing in. You must face it without fear, Maria said. Let go of everything. Your guilt, your pain, even me. The final confrontation. Ethan stepped forward, facing the colossal tree. The shadows screamed, their forms lunging at him, but the locket's light shielded him. He placed his hand on the tree's pulsating bark, feeling its raw, ancient power. Visions flooded his mind. Countless lives consumed by the forest, their souls bound to its roots. The shadow loomed behind him, its voice a deafening roar. You cannot win. Fear is eternal. Ethan closed his eyes, clutching the locket. He thought of Maria, her sacrifice, and the love they had shared. For the first time, he felt no fear, only peace. The end of the forest. The locket exploded in a brilliant burst of light, engulfing the tree and the shadows. Ethan felt the ground shake as the forest began to collapse around him. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The tree's roots withered, its glow fading until it was nothing but ash. The forest's oppressive energy vanished, replaced by an overwhelming stillness, not the unnatural silence of before, but a calm, natural quiet. The aftermath. Ethan woke at the edge of the forest, the morning sun warming his face. The trees were ordinary now, their twisted forms gone. Birds chirped, and the wind carried a gentle hum. In his hand, he found the remains of Maria's locket, now just a simple metal frame. Inside was a photo of Maria, smiling. On the back was a new inscription, "Thank you for setting us free." Ethan stood, looking back at the forest one last time. He knew its darkness was gone for good. As he walked away, a sense of peace washed over him. Maria was finally free, and so was he. This concludes the saga of the Silent Forest. Let me know if you'd like any additional elements or changes.